before the temple, before the law, before Levi ever lifted incense or the tabernacle ever cast a shadow, there was a man, crowned with glory but unknown by name, clothed not in the lineage of priests but in mystery, no father, no mother, no beginning, no end, a priest, a king, a figure who stepped out of eternity and into the path of Abraham, only to vanish just as quickly. And yet his story never truly ended. He was not just a man, he was a sign, a whisper of a greater priest-king to come, one whose name would echo in heaven and reign forever. This is the story of Melchizedek, the one whose order never died. The desert wind whispered across the plains as the caravan moved like a serpent through the sand. Tents of goat hair flapped in rhythm, herds followed behind. The sun bled into the dunes, a molten crown upon a golden world. At the front rode a man, weathered and watchful. Abram, son of Terah, called out of Ur by a voice only he had heard. His face bore the lines of many journeys, not just miles, but the weight of obedience. Behind him walked a nephew he had taken as his own, Lot, and between them a growing silence. Lot's herds had grown, and with them conflict. Abram paused on a rise and scanned the horizon. His thoughts, as always, drifted between promise and present. The God who had called him had made many declarations, of land, of seed, of nations. Yet he remained a wanderer, a man of tents, not towers. Far ahead, past the wilderness, lay Canaan. But to the east, through a land of kings and battlegrounds, stirred the tensions of war. News had traveled, cities had rebelled against their overlords, 5 kings against 4. The battle lines were drawn in the valley of Siddim, and Lot, settled in Sodom, was unknowingly walking into a storm. That night, beneath stars brighter than any torch, Abram spoke with God. The heavens were silent, but his spirit stirred. He knew something was coming. Not just a decision of land or livestock, but of destiny. The valley of Siddim was a scar on the land, a pit where kings gathered to crush rebellion under iron and fire. East of the Dead Sea, the soil was thick with tar pits and blackened trenches. Smoke curled from scattered fires, and armor clanked as 4 mighty kings prepared to remind 5 rebellious cities who ruled them. Chedorlaomer of Elam, the warlord king, feared across the east. With him, Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, and Tidal, king of nations, united in conquest, fueled by pride, hardened by victory. For 12 years the cities of the plain had bowed to them, offering gold, grain, and obedience. But in the 13th, rebellion bloomed. Now in the 14th came reckoning. The kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela Zoar mustered their forces. Chariots lined the ridge. Shields clattered in the morning wind. They stood not for righteousness, but for their freedom, their indulgence, and their pride. Among their cities, Lot lived unaware of the coming tide. The nephew of Abram had chosen Sodom for its wealth and waters, not for its wisdom. But choices made in ease often lead to chains forged in war. At sunrise, the valley erupted in chaos. Swords clashed, arrows whistled, kings shouted across smoke and dust. But the 4 eastern kings were seasoned, brutal, unified. The 5 rebels fell quickly, routed by ruthless force. Sodom fled into the tar pits, their soldiers sinking or burning. The kings of Gomorrah and Admah were captured. Tidal's warriors ransacked camps. Loot flowed like rivers, silver, grain, women, and livestock. And among the prisoners was Lot, bound, bruised, and dragged toward exile. his family, his fortune, his freedom, taken in a single day. But the heavens were not silent. Far north, in the oaks of Mamre, a messenger tore across the hills. Sand kicked from his heels, voice cracked with urgency. "Abram, Lot, your nephew, taken. The kings have conquered Sodom. They march east." Abram's face went cold. He said nothing at first. Then he stood. A silent fire lit his eyes, not rage, not fear, purpose. The same God who had called him would now send him into war. He summoned his trained men, 318 servants, warriors of his household, born in his tents, taught in his ways. He called on Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, his allies among the Amorites, not for plunder, not for politics, but for family and something deeper. As night fell, Abram mounted his horse. This was not the march of a king. It was the rise of a patriarch with a covenant in his bones. In the darkness they moved, a silent column threading the hills northward to Dan. There, beneath stars older than thrones, Abram would strike. He would not fight alone. For though heaven said little, the eternal was near, and a priest was already watching. Nightfall draped the hill country like a veil, thick and soundless. The moon hung like a blade in the sky, casting silver across the rocks of Dan. The air was cool, but tension burned in every heartbeat. Abram crouched behind a ridge, his cloak blending with the stones. Around him were his 318 trained men, sons of his household, hands hardened from labor, now gripped on sword hilts. They were not warriors by profession, but by purpose. He had studied the campfires below. The 4 eastern kings, overconfident from victory, had grown careless in their spoils. They celebrated with stolen wine and songs of conquest. Guards laughed and dice rattled, the watch weak, the gates unmanned. But Abram was no fool. He knew that heaven had not brought him this far to fail now. He divided his men into 3 companies, moving like shadows across the valley. They would strike with speed, not numbers. Surprise would be their sword, a low whistle, a rustle of movement, then chaos. From the east, torches exploded into the camp, hurled into tents and storage. Screams echoed, horses reared. From the south, Abram's men surged with slings and blades, cutting through the dazed guards. The final flank struck from the west, encircling the enemy before they could mount a defense. Chedorlaomer's men, caught in drunken stupor, fumbled for armor. Tidal shouted orders, but his voice was drowned in confusion. The mighty kings who had toppled 5 cities now stumbled under the weight of a shepherd's household. Abram's blade found its mark again and again, not driven by bloodlust but by deliverance. And in the heart of the camp, bound in rope and fear, Lot. The moment their eyes met, Lot gasped. "Uncle?" Abram knelt, cutting the ropes without a word. Behind them, flames flickered, and the night echoed with the fall of nations. They gathered the captives, women, children, elders. They reclaimed the stolen herds and goods. But Abram took no spoil. His victory was not for gain, it was for justice. By dawn, the war was over. The kings of the east fled across the Jordan, humiliated and broken, their alliance shattered, their pride burned. And Abram, the man with no kingdom, returned with his people, not as a raider, but as a deliverer. Word spread quickly. Sodom's people whispered his name in awe. Gomorrah's few survivors praised the God of Abram. Even those who had mocked his quiet life in tents now saw the fire that rested on his obedience. But beyond the hills of the Jordan, another figure stirred. Melchizedek, king of ancient Salem, had been watching. He had seen the clash not just of swords, but of destinies. The priest of the Most High God would now step into history, not to fight, but to bless. The sun spilled across the hills like wine from a chalice, golden and thick, staining the stones of Canaan with light. The land was quiet again, bruised by war but alive with relief. The clash of kings was over, and from the gates of Salem, the ancient city whose name meant peace, a figure emerged. He rode neither chariot nor stallion. He bore no trumpet, no army. Yet he moved with the authority of both king and priest. His name whispered on winds the Hebrews did not yet understand. Melchizedek. Clothed in flowing robes the color of wheat at harvest, his eyes were deeper than wells and older than mountains. His beard was white, yet his face unwrinkled. No scribe knew his genealogy. No scroll bore his father's name. He had no beginning of days nor end of life. He was, and always had been. The people along the road parted for him. Some bowed without knowing why. Others watched, captivated, unsure whether this was a man or something more. The scent of incense trailed behind him. His steps left no dust, and in his hands, bread and wine. He bore no weapons, yet the powers of heaven moved in silence around him. On the plains of Shav, outside the ruins of battle, Abram stood with his company. His face was still streaked with ash. His men tended to captives, to livestock, to wounds, but Abram stood still, sensing something he had never felt before. Then he saw him. Melchizedek approached like a calm in the middle of a storm. His presence did not command submission, it invited reverence. The patriarch who had just conquered kings found himself humbled in the presence of a greater king still. He said nothing at first. Melchizedek lifted the bread and wine before Abram. Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. The words washed over the battlefield like oil upon wounds. Abram bowed, not because of the man, but because of the spirit that burned within him. He had seen many kings, he had spoken to God. But this was a bridge between heaven and earth, a priest who was also a king. Without hesitation, Abram reached into the spoils of war, not for himself, but to give 1/10 to Melchizedek, a tithe, not demanded, not required, but offered. It was recognition, worship, and surrender all at once, and Melchizedek received it, not as a payment, but as a sign that a new order had touched the earth, an eternal priesthood, one without bloodline or age, one whose shadow would stretch all the way to Calvary. As quickly as he appeared, Melchizedek turned. He walked back toward Salem without fanfare, the bread and wine now consumed, the blessings spoken. Abram watched him go, heart stirred by a mystery he would not understand in full for generations. And heaven smiled, because the echo of this moment would one day thunder in the writings of David, and again in the book of Hebrews, and again in the life of a man who too would bring bread and wine. The priesthood of eternity had just stepped into time. The winds of battle had stilled, but the silence that followed was more sacred than any trumpet's call. On the quiet plain outside the Valley of the Kings, time slowed. There, standing between the ashes of war and the gates of peace, Melchizedek lifted bread in his left hand and wine in his right. Not as a gesture of mere hospitality, but as a priest officiating an eternal mystery. The bread was thick, unleavened, marked by heat and ash. The wine, deep red, glimmered in a cup carved from ancient stone. And though neither man said much, the act spoke louder than prophecy. Abram, fresh from battle, blood on his garments and sweat in his eyes, stood before him, a conqueror made small by the presence of this eternal priest-king. Melchizedek extended the bread first. "Eat," he said simply, his voice like low thunder. "This is the bread of peace, offered not in war, but in covenant." Abram took it, his hands trembling slightly. The last time he had eaten, he was planning a rescue. Now he received this loaf not as nourishment, but as communion. Then the cup. Melchizedek lifted it toward the heavens. "To the Most High God, El Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth, the one who delivered kings into your hand, and guards your destiny in his own." Abram drank. It was wine, yes, but it burned like prophecy down his throat. It awakened something ancient within him, something that stretched beyond his own life, something of nations, of kings, of priests to come. Then came the blessing. Melchizedek raised both hands over Abram. His eyes were closed, but his words cracked like holy fire across the plains. "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, whose footsteps are ordered, whose name shall rise like a star in the heavens. Blessed be the God of Abram, who makes dust into destiny, and breathes kings out of wanderers." As he spoke, the sun broke through the clouds above them. A shaft of gold lit the spot where they stood, two figures, one mortal, one mysterious. Time held its breath. Abram dropped to one knee, not out of duty, but revelation. This priest, this Melchizedek, he was not just a holy man, he was a prototype, a foreshadow, a living echo of a covenant yet to be born in blood and fulfilled on a cross. Abram rose and opened the satchel slung across his back. From it, he drew the spoils he had refused to keep, gold coins, fine cloth, incense, silver, and measured out 1/10. He placed it at Melchizedek's feet. There were no words, no bargain, no requirement. It was worship. The bread and wine were now part of him, so was the blessing, so was the mystery. As Melchizedek turned and walked back toward Salem, Abram stood alone, not poorer but richer in purpose. He had not just encountered a priest. He had seen a glimpse of God's future plan, the eternal priesthood that would never fade. And heaven, again, remained quiet, but smiling. That night the stars burned brighter, not because the sky had changed, but because Abram had. He returned from the battlefield not with riches or spoils, but with something eternal, a blessing spoken by a priest whose origins no man could trace. And in that blessing, a name thundered again and again: El Elyon, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. The words rang in his soul long after Melchizedek vanished into the hills of Salem. He repeated them to himself as he unrolled his bedroll. He whispered them as he sat by the fire. And when his servants asked, "Who was that king?" he had no answer, only awe. He remembered Melchizedek's gaze, deep and piercing, not with judgment, but with knowing. He remembered the bread and the wine, not just food, but symbols. He remembered the blessing, not earned, but given. And he remembered the name, not just God, but possessor, not a local deity, not a tribal protector, not the God of one mountain or one valley, but the God of everything, of the heavens where stars were born, and of the earth beneath his sandals. That same night, the king of Sodom arrived. Clad in silk, eyes gleaming with desperation, the man greeted Abram with all the pomp of a ruler desperate to appear powerful. "Give me the people," he said quickly. "Take the goods for yourself." He gestured to the wagons of gold, the herds, the fabrics, the wealth Abram had recovered. But Abram's eyes did not flicker. He had seen a greater king. He looked at the king of Sodom and raised his right hand to heaven. I have sworn to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from you, not a thread or a sandal strap, lest you say, I have made Abram rich. He turned away from the offer, not because the gold wasn't valuable, but because the blessing was. That moment defined him. He was no longer just the man from Ur. He was the man chosen by El Elyon, the Most High. The bread and wine had changed him. The tithe had marked him. The blessing had sealed him. And though Melchizedek had disappeared, his voice still echoed, not in sound, but in authority. God had spoken through a priest who had no genealogy. And now, that God would speak to Abram directly, the God who owned the heavens, was now writing his promise into one man's life. It was a simple act. No trumpet, no choir, no thunder from heaven, just a man kneeling before a king, offering a tenth of what he had won in battle. But the heavens saw everything. When Abram placed his hands on that offering, when his fingers released silver and spice and fine cloth into the hands of a priest he had just met, he was doing far more than giving up treasure. He was testifying. He was saying, everything I have is yours. I did not win this war. I do not own this victory. I serve a God who reigns beyond kings and crowns. And God Most High heard him. Long before tithes were written into Mosaic law, long before priests were chosen from Levi, long before the temple or the tabernacle or the Ark of the Covenant, there was this moment. Abram gave not out of religion, but revelation. He had seen something in Melchizedek, a flicker of eternity, a divine presence wrapped in human form, a priest who stood in the gap between God and man, not appointed by lineage, but by heaven itself. He tithed not because he had to, but because he understood. The blessing Melchizedek gave was not a reward, it was a reality, and this tithe was a response to that truth. The angels watched it unfold with reverence. This was not just a tithe, it was a seed, one that would bloom into generations of worship, sacrifice, and covenant. One day the Levites would carry tithes to Jerusalem. One day the storehouses of the temple would overflow. One day Jesus himself would observe the widow's mite. But all of it would trace back to this moment, to a wandering shepherd and a silent priest on a battlefield altar. The book of Hebrews would later say it clearly. Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abram. Because Melchizedek lives forever, a priesthood greater than Levi, a tithe that transcended time, a covenant offered before covenants were even written. And when Abram rose to his feet, the offering now in Melchizedek's hands, he did not feel empty. He felt anchored. He had aligned his soul not just with a king, but with a kingdom. He had entered into an order that would never pass away. He was gone. No chariot tracks, no scroll left behind, no name carved in stone, no echo of footsteps trailing into the hills of Salem, just silence. Melchizedek, king of righteousness, priest of the Most High God, the one who blessed Abram with bread, wine, and words of eternal weight, had vanished, and no one knew where he came from, or where he went. The people whispered, was he a Canaanite king, a messenger of El Elyon, an angel in flesh, a vision, a spirit? Abram didn't answer them, not because he didn't know, but because even he had no words for what he had just experienced. He sat outside his tent that night, alone. The stars blinked overhead, the same stars God had once told him to count, but they looked different now, not smaller, not fewer, just quieter, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. There is a kind of silence that follows war. There is another that follows a miracle. But there is a holy silence that follows a direct touch from eternity. That was this. The hush after Melchizedek's voice stopped echoing. The stillness after the bread and wine were consumed. The quiet after a greater king had walked among men and left. The next morning, the valley looked the same. Dust, scorched fields, stray arrows, broken chariots, dented helmets, men returning to cities that no longer stood tall. But in Abram's soul, something had changed. There was a presence that hadn't left with Melchizedek, a weight that had settled in his spirit, not heavy but holy, a whisper that said, "There's more coming, much more." He had questions, of course. Where had this king-priest come from? Why had he appeared now? Why only once? But there were no answers, only a deep peace, and a growing sense that this priest was not the end of the story, but the beginning of something that would echo through generations. It would be centuries before his name was written again, in a psalm, then in a letter, then fulfilled in a man who wore a crown of thorns and offered wine from a cup. But for now, Abram simply sat in the silence, letting the weight of glory do what words never could. Generations passed. The tents of Abram gave way to the throne of David. The shepherd king now ruled from Jerusalem, once called Salem, the same city that had birthed a priest king no one had seen since. And though David wore a crown, led armies, and penned psalms, he often wandered outside the palace to talk with God, alone, barefoot, honest, searching. One night, as the stars shimmered and the Ark of the Covenant rested in a tent nearby, David picked up his lyre and whispered into the silence, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.'" He paused. It wasn't just music. It was prophecy flowing from a place he couldn't explain. His hand trembled, his eyes burned. Then the words came like thunder wrapped in poetry. "The Lord has sworn, and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." In the order of Melchizedek, David stopped playing. The name, Melchizedek. Where had he heard it? It wasn't part of Levitical law. No scrolls mentioned his birth or death. No priest in the temple claimed descent from him. But his name had echoed through history, like a quiet breath through stone. A priest and a king. One who brought bread and wine. One who received tithes before tithing was law. One who blessed Abram in the name of the Most High. David didn't know how, but the Spirit inside him knew. This Melchizedek was a shadow, a sign of something yet to come. What priest could reign as king? What king could offer a sacrifice greater than bulls and goats? What blood could last forever? He didn't have the answers, but the psalm had already been written. A priest, forever, not in the line of Aaron, but in the line of eternity. That verse, Psalm 110, would be quoted more than any other Old Testament passage in the New Testament, whispered by prophets, preached by apostles, fulfilled in Christ. But that night it was just a king with a harp, and a name that refused to be forgotten. Melchizedek, not a relic, but a prophetic blueprint, a priest who would return, not in robes of royalty, but in the scars of redemption. Centuries faded like mist over mountaintops. The Levitical priesthood flourished in Israel, robes stitched in gold, sacrifices made morning and evening, the temple humming with incense and ritual. The sons of Aaron came and went. High priests were appointed, then buried. Generations turned like pages. But the shadow of a forgotten priest lingered behind the curtain. Melchizedek. His name wasn't chanted in temple songs. His priesthood wasn't passed down like garments. No altar bore his seal. Yet his order had never ended, because God himself had sworn it. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. Psalm 110:4. The Levitical priesthood was bound by bloodlines. It was inherited, temporary, and earthly. But Melchizedek's priesthood? Without father, without mother, without genealogy, without beginning or end. His was an order of eternity, a heavenly pattern dropped into time only briefly and then hidden again, until its fulfillment, and then it happened. In a stable in Bethlehem, a child was born, not to the tribe of Levi, but to Judah, the royal line. A child wrapped in swaddling cloth, not priestly linen. No one knew, but heaven did. This child, Jesus, would one day step into the temple, flip the tables of the old priesthood, and offer bread and wine at his final supper. Echoing Melchizedek in every gesture, he would not be appointed by lineage but by divine oath, not to enter a temple made with hands, but a heavenly one. And the writer of Hebrews, under the Spirit's fire, would declare it boldly. He has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning ancestry, but by the power of an indestructible life. Hebrews 7:16. The Levitical priests died, but Jesus lives forever. Melchizedek had no recorded end. Jesus had a death, and then rose to prove it could not hold him. One was a shadow, the other, the substance. The order of Melchizedek never ended, because it was never limited to man. It was an eternal priesthood, a divine design, a promise wrapped in a person. And now, Jesus had stepped fully into it. The priest-king who offers bread and wine, the mediator who blesses, not condemns, the high priest who stands forever at the right hand of the Most High God. The priesthood of Levi would fade, but the order of Melchizedek, it would reign from eternity to eternity. By the time the writer of Hebrews dipped his pen in ink, the temple in Jerusalem was still standing, tall, golden, glorious. Priests came and went, sacrifices still burned, incense still rose. But something had shifted in heaven. The old covenant was passing, the veil had torn, and a greater priesthood had already taken its place. Consider how great this man was. Hebrews 7:4. That's how the writer begins his explanation. Not with Aaron, not with Moses, but with Melchizedek, the priest whose story lasted only a few verses in Genesis, yet whose significance stretched beyond centuries. The message was bold, unthinkable to Jewish ears. Melchizedek was greater than Levi, and therefore Jesus, who came in Melchizedek's order, is greater than all who wore the robes of Aaron. Why? Because Levi paid tithes through Abram, his great-grandfather, to Melchizedek. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak. Hebrews 7:9. That act, the moment when Abram handed 1/10 of his victory spoils to the king of Salem, was not just generous, it was prophetic. It testified that Melchizedek's priesthood outranked Levi's. And if Jesus was a priest in that order, then everything had changed. No more sacrifices that had to be repeated year after year. No more priests who themselves needed forgiveness. No more blood of bulls and goats that could never cleanse a guilty conscience. Instead, from one priest, one offering, one eternal intercession. Such a high priest was fitting for us, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens. Hebrews 7:26. This was the priest we had always needed, not one clothed in tradition, but one clothed in power, purity, and permanence. And Melchizedek? His brief appearance in Genesis was like the first spark before a sunrise, a flicker of the eternal that would one day burn in the face of Christ. He had pointed to something better, someone coming, a priest forever. And now the forever had arrived. In Jesus, the ancient silence was broken. The mysterious priesthood was fulfilled. The bread and wine found their meaning. Melchizedek had blessed Abram once, but Jesus blesses us eternally. It happened in an upper room, a quiet chamber in Jerusalem, once called Salem, the city of peace where Melchizedek once reigned. Jesus, the rabbi from Nazareth, weary in flesh, blazing in spirit, reclined at a table with 12 men. The mood was heavy. The air held the scent of lamb, roasted bitter herbs, and coming betrayal. Then he reached for bread, not just as part of the Passover, not as ritual, but as fulfillment. He broke it in his hands, the same way a priest might prepare an offering, and looked each disciple in the eye. "This is my body, broken for you." Then he took the cup, red as covenant, deep as prophecy. "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Bread, wine. Centuries ago, a man named Melchizedek had stepped from the shadows of eternity, handed these same elements to Abram, and blessed him in the name of God Most High. Now the true priest-king, Jesus, handed them again, but this time he would become them. That night, as his body was broken on a cross, and his blood spilled onto a cursed hill, Jesus fulfilled every symbol Melchizedek had ever carried. He wasn't just a priest, he was the priest, not just of Israel, but of humanity, not by genealogy, but by divine decree, not in a temple of stone, but on a cross of wood. You are a priest forever. In the order of Melchizedek, the words of Psalm 110 rang through eternity as nails pierced his hands, as the sky turned dark, as the veil tore in the temple. Melchizedek had offered bread and wine. Jesus offered flesh and blood. One blessed Abram, the other redeemed the world. And on the third day, the tomb broke open, the stone rolled away. The priest rose, alive, eternal, unstoppable. He ascended not into another earthly tabernacle, but into heaven itself, where he sat at the right hand of God, still wearing the scars of intercession, still speaking blessings over his people, still receiving tithes, not of gold, but of worship, faith, and surrendered hearts. The order of Melchizedek was never about a man. It was about a mystery, a priesthood not of bloodline but of eternity, a priesthood that blesses, a priesthood that never ends. In Jesus, that mystery became reality. So when you take the bread and drink the cup, you are not just remembering the cross, you are stepping into the ancient priesthood. You are receiving the blessing of God Most High. The priest-king lives, and his order, like his mercy, endures forever. And so, from the ashes of ancient wars to the upper room of Jerusalem, from the mystery of Melchizedek to the majesty of Christ, we find one unshakable truth. God's plan was never random. His priesthood was never temporary. His love was never limited. Melchizedek was the shadow. Jesus is the fulfillment. Bread, wine, blessing. They were never just symbols, they were prophetic promises. And through Christ, those promises now rest upon you. You are not forgotten. You are chosen. You are covered by a priest who never dies. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Bible stories told in a way you've never heard before. And in the comments, Tell us what part of this story stirred your spirit the most. We read every word. Until next time, keep walking in faith, keep trusting in truth, and remember, your story is part of His story. God bless you.